Okay, Bradley, what's tip number 3, please?
Okay, so tip number 3 is essentially to really actively challenge students on what they think is best for them. So I'm growing increasingly aware that when people get to self-select how they study and learn, pretty much they do the opposite of what all the research suggests they should do. So the classic one, I think a lot of people know, like rereading versus retrieval practice. Like we know retrieval is probably more effective, and yet students will tend to self-select rereading. We know spacing versus kind of blocking. Students tend to leave stuff to the last minute, whereas we know it's more effective to do it in advance. And the other one that I'm finding increasingly interesting is, I would say when I go into schools, about 80% of students tell me it's better for them. They learn better if they revise whilst listening to music. And yet when you look at the research, there are some individual differences, but music that has lyrics leads to a huge degradation in learning and memory compared to no music or music without lyrics. And yet students will swear blind that they know what works best for them. And so I'm wrestling with it, but I find it interesting, the balance between giving students autonomy, which I think is an important part of motivation, versus people make really bad choices, and people tend to do what they prefer as opposed to what's best for them. So the example that I always come up with at the moment, my 4-year-old, he prefers chocolate buttons for breakfast. Like that's what he likes for breakfast, but I know as an adult that's not what's best for him. And I think something similar happens with learning and memory and revising, is people do what they like because revising is hard, so we do stuff that makes it more fun, but not necessarily what's actually best for us. And so now I think it's not enough just for educators to know about being research informed. We have to kind of make this stuff explicit to students and challenge some of their preconceived notions, because as they get older, the decisions they make working independently become more important, and we need to help educate them to make better decisions.
This is another great one, Bradley. I'm really pleased you've picked this. It reminds me of when I used to, with my Year 11s, I used to say in the build-up to exams, right, we're going to have a revision lesson here, and you can just bring in, go through the textbook, go through exam papers, work on the things that you feel you need to work on. And I'll never forget this girl, Erin. She used to sit there and she would do fraction after fraction after fraction. And I'd say, well, why are you working on fractions, Erin? And she says, oh, because I like them. I love a fraction. Right. And like in quadratic graphs, she didn't have a flipping clue what one of them was, but forget them. Yeah. Let's just keep working on the fractions. And it's really tricky. As you say, the trade-off between kind of motivation, autonomy, and kind of self-direction feels a tricky one. And also, of course, you've got that issue that if you've got 30 kids in a class, you could kind of make the argument that as a teacher, you might not actually be able to pinpoint exactly what each of those 30 need to work on. And surely the best person to do it is the student themselves. But as you say, it feels like they need educating in, certainly like things like Bjork's desirable difficulties, I think are a really good one to share with students along the lines of, look, spacing feels hard, but here's why it's better. Interleaving feels hard. And crucially, practice testing feels hard, certainly compared to watching a YouTube video or reading notes, but here's why it's better. It feels like kids need some kind of real practical examples and explaining the theory in a way that they can understand so they can make those informed choices, if that makes sense. It
does, and I have to say, because we go into I see a broad range of schools, the progress in this area I think is phenomenal in the last few years. 10 years ago, it used to be how to help make a revision timetable, whereas there is more of a conversation around the conditions within that revision is better. And the big challenge for me is I don't know any domain apart from school where, so students don't go to school for intrinsic motivation. They get told, legally, parents, you have to send your kids to school. So I'm asking you to develop intrinsic motivation for something that wasn't your choice to do, and we know because desirable difficulties it's going to be tough, and so I'm asking you to choose the more difficult path and not make it fun and enjoyable at times repeatedly. And so you can see why people do want to make it easier and more fun, because it's not their choice and it's difficult, but we need to help them with that decision. So it's a hard one, but I'm starting to think it's one of the most important things we can help them, knowing the conditions under which they learn best, as opposed to what just they like the most.
Yeah, I agree. And if we just shift to the practical slide there for a second, So I agree with you. I've certainly used to spend a lot of time on making a revision timetable. And the kids would spend ages just laminating things and colouring things in and all sorts. It was an absolute disaster. What I try and do now, I've certainly found, I've spoken about this on a previous Tips for Teachers video, even showing them the diagram of the forgetting curve I think is quite powerful. The fact that every time they revisit something it flattens out this slope of the forgetting curve. I find that quite powerful. And also the Dunlosky Strengthening the Student Toolbox paper that does things like shows that practice testing is more effective than rereading. Things like that I've seen to be quite effective. Is there anything else practically you'd suggest that teachers could kind of share with students, or approaches that could help them make more informed choices?
Yeah, so just to echo, I agree. We do very similar stuff. Like we show them the forgetting curve. We should talk about the Dunlosky toolkit. On a really basic practical level, one of our favourite activities to illustrate one of the areas is, if I ask you to draw the Apple logo from memory, most people actually aren't very good at drawing the Apple logo.
Yeah.
And yet they've seen it thousands of times in their life. And yet if you saw it now on screen, you'd go, oh, I can identify which company that is. That's obviously the Apple logo. But it's a great illustration of how there's a difference between familiarity and real deep knowledge. And so we can do that, experiment with them as an icebreaker to talking about, so we need to revisit. Likewise, there's loads of activities that you can do around multitasking. So students are convinced that they can multitask and, got tabs open or TV or YouTube at the same time. And yet there's loads of neat experiments you can do where it's impossible to do two things at once, and yet we assume we can. So I think starting not talking about it from a revision and learning perspective, but a general principle, and then following up with that with a discussion of, so what does this mean for your revision, is a really good one. And you can do the same with listening to music. You can give basic quizzes and you can see how much people remember in quizzes versus if they don't have distracting lyrics. So yeah, I think nice practical icebreakers I think are a good starting point for that.
I like that. I never thought to do that. I always start with the revision element, but I like that. Show them the power of it first and then link it to revision. That's lovely, that.